You know that feeling when you think you found the perfect escape from all the noise, only for trouble to follow you right into the woods? Well, that's exactly what happened to me the week my wife moved into our secluded mountain cabin. And if you want to hear how one woman's arrogance collided with the last person she should have messed with, then stick around because this is a story you'll never forget. And before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed to Sham Stories so you never miss out on the wildest tales of HOA madness, Karen drama, and jaw-dropping 911 twists. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 12 years, and after a long stint overseas where she served in the military, she finally retired and was looking forward to a peaceful life. We'd owned the cabin for years, but it had always been my getaway spot during hunting season or when I needed a break from city life. It was nestled deep in the pines, at least a 40-minute drive from the nearest store, and sat outside of any official HOA boundaries, or so I thought. Emily arrived with a small moving truck one bright Wednesday morning, and I drove out ahead of her to unlock the place, start the generator, and air out the rooms. The moment we pulled up together, I could tell she fell in love with the place. Way her eyes swept over the lake, shimmering behind the property, and how she breathed in the crisp air like it was medicine. We unloaded her boxes, set her uniforms in the closet, and she started talking about making this place our permanent home. It was perfect, till of course the next morning when the peace shattered. I had left early to run into town for supplies, and Emily stayed behind to start organizing the kitchen. Around 10 a.m., she heard a knock at the door, sharp, fast, impatient. When she opened it, she found herself staring at a woman in her late 50s. With a stiff perm, oversized sunglasses, and a neon windbreaker that screamed control freak. This was Karen, though I didn't know her name yet. Without even introducing herself, she demanded to know what Emily was doing there. Emily, polite as always, said she lived here now, that this was her home. Karen's lips pursed into a thin, angry line. And she claimed this cabin was under community watch and all new residents needed to register with the HOA. Emily told her there was no HOA here, but Karen insisted the rules had recently changed and she was in charge of compliance. Emily, still trying to keep things civil, asked for paperwork to prove it. That's when Karen's tone turned hostile. She accused Emily of trespassing, squatting, and occupying property. Without clearance, whatever that meant, Emily didn't take kindly to being called a trespasser, especially after everything she'd been through in her service. She told Karen firmly to leave the property. But Karen, instead of backing down, stormed off down the dirt driveway while pulling out her phone. 10 minutes later, Emily noticed 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs rolling up, lights flashing. Apparently, Karen had called 911 to report an armed intruder living in the cabin. I was still halfway back from town when I got a text from Emily. "Cops here." Karen called them. "I'm fine. Just hurry." My stomach dropped. Emily wasn't just capable, she was highly trained, but the idea of her being treated like a suspect in our own home made my blood boil. When the deputies stepped out, they kept their hands near their holsters, clearly cautious. Emily stepped out to meet them, calm and collected. One deputy, a tall guy with a buzz cut, asked her to put her hands where they could see them. She complied, all the while explaining she lived there and her husband owned the cabin. Karen was standing a few yards back, smirking like she'd just saved the day. "She's lying," Karen yelled. "I saw her break in yesterday." Dangerous. Emily didn't raise her voice, but she did ask the deputies if she could retrieve her ID from inside. They nodded, following protocol. Emily disappeared into the cabin for a moment and came back with her wallet. She handed over her driver's license first, which showed the cabin's address. Then she pulled out another card, her military ID. The moment the deputies saw it, something changed. Buzzcut's posture relaxed, and the other deputy exchanged a quick glance with him. They asked Karen to step aside. "Ma'am," Buzzcut said to Emily, "thank you for your service. I think we've got this all cleared up." But Karen wasn't having it. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the ID from the deputy's hand. "That's fake," she shrieked. "I know a fake when I see one." The deputies immediately told her to back up, warning her she was interfering with a law enforcement investigation. I arrived right about then, stepping out of my truck to find Emily calm as ever. 2 deputies, clearly irritated, and Karen sputtering with rage. I asked what was going on, and Buzzcut gave me the rundown. Apparently, Karen had called in a possible armed squatter and exaggerated enough details to get an urgent response. Once they confirmed Emily's identity, they realized the whole thing was a waste of resources. I told them I wanted to file a complaint for harassment, but they advised documenting everything first, since Karen wasn't technically trespassing when she knocked on the door. They said they'd make a note in the incident report, though, in case she tried something again. Karen, hearing this, yelled that she'd be back with the HOA board and that we'd regret trying to defy community rules. The deputies rolled their eyes, wished us a good day, and drove off. I walked Emily back inside, trying to laugh it off, but we both knew it wasn't over. Karen had that look in her eye, the one that said she wasn't done, and that she was going to make it her personal mission to drive us out. What she didn't know, though, was that Emily wasn't the type to be intimidated. She had been in worse situations, in far more dangerous places. And if Karen thought she could win this game, she was in for the shock of her life. We locked up, made coffee, and started brainstorming how to handle her next move. Emily wanted to play it smart, gathering evidence, keeping cameras rolling, and making sure every interaction was documented. And me, I was just glad my wife was home and safe, because if Karen thought she could break us, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The silence after the deputies left was thick, almost oppressive, but the tension still lingered in the air like a storm cloud refusing to move on. I stood at the edge of the porch for a moment, scanning the tree line and gravel road beyond, making sure Karen's car was truly gone. Beside me, Emily was still gripping the coffee mug she'd been holding when the whole debacle began. Her knuckles white, her jaw tight. She had held herself with poise during the encounter, but I knew her well enough to recognize the fire in her eyes. It was the kind that came when someone had underestimated her one too many times. Without saying a word, she stepped back inside, set the mug down on the counter, and began pacing the length of the living room. She thinks she can just show up here whenever she wants, making accusations and trying to intimidate us, she said finally, her voice sharp. I leaned against the door frame, watching her. She's not used to people standing up to her, I replied. Especially people who can actually push back without breaking a sweat. Emily stopped, turned to me and smirked. Oh, I can push back, she said. But something tells me she's going to try again, and next time she won't be satisfied with just showing up with the cops. I agreed silently. Kieran's type didn't retreat after a single failed attempt. If anything, they regrouped, plotted, and returned with more ammunition, figuratively, and sometimes literally. That was when I decided we needed to be ready. Not just ready in the sense of knowing what to say or having documents to wave around, but ready in a way that made it crystal clear she was outmatched. Emily and I spent the next few days going about our normal routines, but I could see the way she kept a mental checklist running. She started securing the property more tightly, making sure locks were replaced, motion sensor lights tested, and security cameras repositioned so there were no blind spots. Her years in the service had given her an unshakable instinct for defense, and I wasn't about to question it. On the third day, she sat me down at the kitchen table and slid her laptop toward me. On the screen was a neatly organized file labeled Cabin Defense. Inside were photographs of the property, detailed diagrams of every entry and exit, copies of her military credentials, a folder of legal documents, proof of ownership, HOA bylaws, and prior incidents with Karen documented in painstaking detail. If she comes back, we're going to be the most prepared people she's ever had the misfortune of crossing, Emily said with a hint of satisfaction. That night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset spill orange and purple across the lake, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel in the distance. My shoulders tensed, but the sound faded after a moment, replaced by the gentle lap of water against the dock. Emily must have felt it too, because she glanced at me and said, "It's not her, not yet," but the not yet hung in the air, between us like a promise. A week later, the yet arrived. It was late morning, and I was stacking firewood when Emily's voice called from inside the cabin. "She's here." I stepped inside just in time to see Karen's car pull up to the gate, another vehicle right behind it. This time, she hadn't brought the county deputies. She brought someone from the HOA board, a tall, thin man with slick back hair, and a briefcase, clutched under one arm. They both got out, Karen wearing that smug expression that meant she thought she was about to win. "Well," I muttered, "let's give them a show." Emily didn't bother changing out of the fitted black jacket she was wearing. It made her look sharper, more imposing. We walked down to the gate together, and as soon as Karen saw us, she launched into her performance. "You're trespassing on HOA-managed property," she announced, loud enough for the lake to hear. "We've reviewed the boundaries, and this cabin falls within our jurisdiction. You're going to need to vacate until ownership is sorted." The man with her nodded like a wind-up toy, pulling papers from his briefcase. "We have an interim notice here from the board," he began, but Emily raised a hand to stop him. "You might want to reconsider reading that out loud," she said calmly. "Because the moment you claim this property belongs to your HOA, you're stepping into legal territory you can't afford." Her voice was even, but there was steel in it, and I could see the man falter slightly. Karen, of course, plowed ahead. "We've already contacted the police about your refusal to comply," she said, "and they will be here shortly." Emily smiled, an expression I'd learned meant trouble for whoever was on the receiving end. "Good," she said. "Then they can confirm my legal standing and see the updated restraining order we've filed naming you specifically. Karen, that way we can skip the formalities next time and have you removed immediately." Karen's face shifted just slightly, flicker of something like doubt passing through her eyes, but she recovered quickly. "You're bluffing," she snapped. Emily reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out a crisp legal document, and held it just out of reach. "You want to test that theory?" she asked. The man beside Karen leaned in to look, and I could tell he was already calculating the risk in his head. Before the standoff could escalate, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. 3 patrol cars rolled up this time, the 2 from before, and when the officers stepped out, their demeanor was noticeably different. They greeted Emily with respectful nods, one even giving a slight salute. Karen noticed it too, and for the first time, her confidence wavered in plain sight. "Ma'am," one of the officers said to Emily, "we've reviewed the property. Records in you are well within your rights. The HOA has no jurisdiction here," he turned to Karen. "We also have a note on file regarding your previous false reports. This is your official warning." The color drained from Karen's face, but she muttered something under her breath about just following protocol before retreating toward her car. The board member hesitated, glancing between us and Karen, then clearly decided he wanted no part of this anymore and hurried after her. Emily watched them go, then turned to me. "That's round 2, she said. And now she's embarrassed, which means round 3 will be worse. I nodded. We both knew Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Under the constant gray canopy of clouds, the mountains seemed almost to lean in toward the cabin, as if listening to the tension that was steadily building between us and the so-called HOA. A group of nosy neighbors led by Karen, who had somehow decided she was the unofficial sheriff of this remote stretch of land, though no one had ever appointed her to anything. The air was colder that morning, and my wife Emily stood at the small kitchen window, her coffee untouched as she stared toward the gravel road that wound up to our front porch. Her posture stiff because she could see movement Karen's SUV creeping along like a predator on the hunt. I walked up behind her, resting a hand on her shoulder, could feel the quiet strain in her muscles. That guarded readiness that came from years in the military, something most people, especially Karen, had no idea about, because Emily never advertised it. Never bragged about her service, preferring to live a low-key life out here in the woods. We both knew Karen wasn't driving out here for a social visit after the cops had come the first time. Thanks to Karen's ridiculous call about Emily trespassing at my own cabin, she had seemed almost obsessed with monitoring us driving by at random hours, taking photos with her phone, and even peering through binoculars from the end of the road, as though she were conducting some kind of amateur stakeout. Emily turned away from the window and said quietly, "She's going to pull something again today," and I couldn't disagree. So I followed her gaze back toward the driveway, where Karen had now stopped, engine idling, her tinted window half cracked. I could see her silhouette leaning toward a phone, lips moving, and though we couldn't hear her, could guess what was happening. Another call to the sheriff's department. Another attempt to paint Emily as some intruder or criminal, and all because she couldn't accept that my wife lived here now. The bitterness in Karen's eyes wasn't just about the cabin. I was starting to think it was about control, about the fact that someone had moved into her area without her approval, and she hated that our lives existed outside her authority. We went about our morning routine anyway. Emily double-checking the latch on the back door, me hauling in a stack of firewood. But every few minutes we'd glance toward the window, and sure enough, about 40 minutes later we heard the distant crunch of tires again, heavier this time. Not Karen's SUV, but the unmistakable sound of a county patrol truck making its way up the gravel. And Emily exhaled slowly, setting her coffee cup down with deliberate calm. We both stepped onto the porch just as the deputy parked in front, his door swinging open, and Karen's SUV slid in right behind, her door opening too. She came out briskly, pointing toward Emily like she was unveiling a dangerous fugitive, her voice sharp enough to carry over the wind. "That's her officer. She's trespassing. She doesn't belong here." And the deputy, looking caught between annoyance and protocol, began to approach, asking for Emily's identification. His tone formal, but not hostile. Emily, without a word, reached into her jacket and pulled out the slim black leather case, flipping it open to reveal her military ID, the photo crisp, the name and rank clear, and I watched the deputy's whole demeanor change in an instant. His shoulders loosening as he read, his voice shifting to a more respectful register, his eyes cutting sideways toward Karen with something close to irritation. Karen, who had been standing with arms folded in smug expectation, visibly faltered, the flush rising to her face as she stammered, I didn't know." But the deputy interrupted, telling her there was no violation here, no trespassing, and that she needed to stop making unfounded calls. Emily didn't say anything at first, just gave Karen a look steady, unblinking, that carried more weight than any words could have, and in that moment I knew Karen was rattled, maybe even humiliated, though I doubted it would be enough to stop her from trying again. As the patrol truck rolled away and Karen retreated to her SUV, Emily and I went back inside. But there was no denying that a new layer had been added to this conflict. Karen now knew exactly who she was dealing with, and that knowledge seemed to both scare and provoke her in equal measure, like a predator realizing its prey might actually be more dangerous than itself. And I had the uneasy sense that this was just the middle of the storm, not the end. The tension in the air after the cops left that night didn't dissolve. If anything, it only settled deeper over the cabin like an unwelcome fog. My wife Emily tried to focus on unpacking the rest of her gear, but her hands moved slower, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the door as though she expected Karen to barge in again. I tried to lighten the mood, offering to make her coffee and joking about installing an anti-Karen security system, but my attempts barely earned a small smile. Emily wasn't easily rattled. She had been in more high-pressure situations during her military career than I could count, but this wasn't the battlefield. This was supposed to be home. And having someone in the neighborhood already targeting her just for existing was the kind of attack she hadn't prepared for. That night, we went to bed later than usual, both of us awake far too long listening to the creaks of the old wooden cabin, wondering if they were just the sounds of a house settling or signs of someone creeping outside. The next morning I woke to the distant sound of a vehicle idling. Peering through the blinds, I spotted Karen's SUV parked at the end of the driveway. She was just sitting there, sunglasses on, head turned toward the cabin, probably thinking she looked inconspicuous. Emily joined me at the window, her jaw tightening. "She's casing the place," she muttered, and it wasn't paranoia in her voice, it was certainty. I told her to stay inside and decided to walk down the driveway, keeping my posture calm but firm. As soon as Karen saw me approaching, she rolled down her window, her voice already dripping with false innocence. "Morning," she said, making sure everything's okay after last night, community safety. I told her plainly that her surveillance was not welcome and that she was trespassing by sitting there. She smirked and replied, "Public road? As a member of the HOA board, I have a duty to keep an eye on things." Her tone made it clear this was about intimidation, not safety. I warned her to leave, and she drove off, but not without snapping a few pictures with her phone first. When I got back inside, Emily was pacing, "She's escalating," she said. "You know that, right?" I did. And I also knew that ignoring her would only embolden her further. The problem was that confronting her too directly could give her the ammunition she wanted to paint us as aggressors. Over the next week, Karen's tactics became more sophisticated. She began sending official-looking letters from the HOA, claiming that the cabin was not in compliance with various supposed regulations. Everything from the unauthorized structure of our porch to excessive noise disturbances that neither of us had caused. Emily wanted to fight each accusation point by point, but I suggested we document everything first. I bought a high-resolution security camera system and installed it around the property. Emily's military precision came in handy. She mapped out ideal vantage points, ensuring there were no blind spots. "If she comes onto the property again," Emily said, "we'll have her on record." We didn't have to wait long. Nights later, at around midnight, one of the cameras sent an alert to my phone. Pulling it up, I saw a shadowy figure near the back porch. Zooming in, there was no mistaking the outline. It was Karen, flashlight in hand, peering into our windows. I told Emily to stay inside while I stepped out with a bright spotlight, aiming it straight at her. She froze like a deer in headlights. Before stumbling back toward the woods behind the cabin, I called out that she was trespassing and that the sheriff would be getting the footage. Karen didn't answer. She just disappeared into the trees. The next morning, I brought the footage straight to the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty recognized Karen immediately. "She's been a problem for years," he said, shaking his head, "always skirting the line just enough to harass people without getting herself arrested." Still, he assured me the incident would be documented, which was exactly what we needed for a paper trail. Emily, however, wasn't satisfied with just a report. "This woman is testing boundaries," she said. "She's trying to see how far she can push before we break." Her instincts told her that Karen wouldn't stop until she felt she'd won. And in HOA terms, winning usually meant forcing people to move out. That Sunday, we decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting at the community center. Karen didn't expect us to show up. It's the moment we walked in, her smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, acting as though she were happy to see us. "Welcome," she said, overly loud for the benefit of the others in the room. The meeting started with mundane items, but halfway through, Karen slid a new agenda item into the discussion. Review of unapproved occupancy in HOA properties. She tried to make it sound general, but all eyes turned toward us. Let her talk for a few minutes, throwing out terms like safety protocols and vetting processes, till she finally suggested that all residents submit background checks to the HOA for approval. That's when Emily stood. "I'm happy to submit mine," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge. "In fact, here's my ID." She reached into her pocket and pulled out her active military identification card, holding it up so the entire room could see. A few gasps went around the table. Karen's expression cracked, her smug mask slipping as she realized what this meant. Emily continued, "I serve this country. I've been through more background checks than anyone in this room, so unless the HOA has higher clearance than the Department of Defense, I'd say I'm more than qualified to live here." The room was silent. Karen mumbled something about process and tried to move on, but the damage was done. Several members shifted uncomfortably, clearly rethinking whatever narrative Karen had been spreading about us. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached us privately to say they had no problem with us living there and that Karen had a history of exaggerating issues. It was the first time I felt like we might actually be turning the tide. But Emily wasn't convinced. It was over. "She's humiliated," she said as we drove home. "That's when people like her get dangerous." Over the next few days, we kept our guard up. The camera stayed running, and Emily's instincts remained sharp. We didn't see Karen in person for a while, but her influence lingered small. Acts of hostility cropped up, like trash dumped near the driveway, or strange cars idling by the cabin late at night. It was clear she wasn't done, just regrouping. One evening, Emily suggested we take a walk around the property to check the perimeter. The air was cool, the forest alive with the sound of crickets. As we circled toward the back edge of the lot, we found a fresh set of tire tracks cutting through the grass, leading right up to the tree line. Emily knelt, studying them under her flashlight. "These weren't here this morning," she said. Her gaze shifted toward the dark woods. Beyond, she's watching again. We didn't see Karen that night, but knowing she was still out there only made us more determined to protect our home. Emily started drawing up a plan not just for defense, but for pushing back in a way Karen couldn't ignore. Under the looming gray clouds of early evening, the situation between my wife and the HOA was escalating into something neither of us could have anticipated when we moved into the cabin. Karen's visits had become more frequent and more aggressive, her tone dripping with disdain every time she addressed either of us. The cabin had always been a sanctuary for me, a place away from the chaos of city life, but lately, with Karen showing up almost daily to remind us of some obscure HOA regulation, felt like we were living under a magnifying glass. She had started documenting our every move, snapping photos of our vehicles, timing when we arrived and left, and even standing on the edge of our driveway just to glare inside. My wife, being calm and patient, had tried to avoid escalating the matter, but Karen was determined to make us feel unwelcome. One afternoon, after returning from a supply run into town, we noticed Karen talking animatedly to two other HOA board members near her front porch. As soon as she saw us pull in, she stopped talking and gave us the kind of smile you reserve for people you're about to set up for trouble. My gut told me she was planning something bigger than her usual harassment. Days later, the moment I feared came to pass. Karen arrived, this time not alone, but with two more board members trailing behind her like backup dancers. Holding clipboards and cameras, she announced loudly, in earshot of the neighbors, that we were in violation of multiple HOA rules she conveniently couldn't produce in writing. She accused us of storing unauthorized equipment on our property, pointing to the generator we kept for emergencies, and of harboring non-residents because my wife's name wasn't yet on the county cabin registry. My wife, keeping her composure, told Karen firmly that she was my spouse and had every right to live there. But Karen smirked and replied, "We'll see what the sheriff has to say about that." The other board members scribbled notes while Karen pulled out her phone. I knew she was calling the police right there in our driveway. The tension thickened as the minutes passed. Karen, still on the phone, began exaggerating the situation. She claimed she felt unsafe, and that two suspicious individuals were refusing to leave property governed by the HOA. I could hear the operator's voice faintly through the receiver, asking her to explain the emergency. Karen glanced at my wife, lowered her voice slightly, and added, "One of them might be impersonating someone they're not." That was the last straw for me. My wife's military background wasn't a secret, but she never flaunted it. Karen implies something as serious as impersonation made my blood boil. I stepped forward and told Karen she was making a dangerous mistake. She only smiled more and told me the police were on their way. The flashing red and blue lights arrived. About 15 minutes later, two deputies stepped out, their expressions calm but alert, clearly expecting a tense situation. Karen ran toward them, waving her arms, and began speaking in rapid bursts. She pointed at us like she was identifying suspects in a lineup, painting herself as a concerned citizen and us as potential threats to community safety. The deputies listened politely, but then turned to us for our side of the story. My wife, without raising her voice, explained that she was my legal spouse and had moved into the cabin with me. She added that she was a veteran and had the paperwork to prove her residence was lawful. Karen interrupted repeatedly, trying to redirect the deputy's attention back to her allegations, but one of them finally raised a hand and told her to wait. That's when my wife calmly reached into her wallet, pulled out her military ID, and handed it to the deputy. The officer looked at it, then at my wife, and his demeanor shifted instantly. "Thank you for your service, ma'am," he said, his tone respectful and firm. Karen's confident smirk faltered for the first time, her eyes darting between the officer and my wife. The deputy turned back to Karen and asked, "Why exactly did you think she was impersonating anyone?" Karen stammered, clearly unprepared to be questioned. The deputy then addressed both of us, assuring that no laws had been broken and that my wife's presence was entirely lawful. They told Karen that false reports could carry serious consequences, and if she continued making unfounded accusations, she could face charges. The second deputy stepped aside to have a more private conversation with my wife. thanking her again for her service and subtly asking if we'd experienced ongoing harassment. From the HOA, my wife didn't go into every detail but mentioned the frequent confrontations and the feeling that we were being targeted. He handed her his card, saying, "If this happens again, call me directly." Karen's face was red by the time the deputies left, her plan having collapsed right in front of the entire neighborhood. The other HOA board members she'd brought along had quietly retreated to their homes during the confrontation, leaving her standing alone in the driveway. She muttered something about misunderstandings before storming off, but I knew she wasn't finished. The way she glanced back at us before disappearing into her house told me she was already thinking of her next move. The problem for her was that now she had exposed herself as someone willing to lie to law enforcement, and that gave us an advantage. My wife and I decided then and there that if Karen wanted to keep escalating, we'd start documenting everything. We set up cameras covering every angle of the cabin, began keeping a written log of her visits, and even alerted a few sympathetic neighbors who had grown tired of the HOA's overreach. What Karen didn't realize was that her attempt to intimidate us had only made us more prepared to fight back, and we were just getting started. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface of our cabin community had now reached a boiling point. And the fragile calm after the last police incident didn't last long. Karen, despite having been embarrassed in front of the entire HOA board and the responding officers when they discovered my wife's military ID, refused to back down from her obsessive need to control everyone and everything around her. She convinced herself and, apparently, a few other HOA loyalists that the only reason the police had sided with us was because they had been intimidated by my wife's credentials, not because Karen's complaints were baseless. This dangerous mix of wounded pride and stubbornness made her even more unpredictable. The next few days were marked by subtle but deliberate acts meant to intimidate. U.S. HOA inspection notices slid under our cabin door without signatures or dates, anonymous letters telling us we were not a good fit for the community, and even a bizarre incident where someone left a pile of gravel across our driveway in the middle of the night to block our truck. My wife remained calm, treating it all like a series of childish tantrums, but I could see in her eyes that she was preparing herself for something bigger. Her military instincts were kicking in, scanning for patterns, predicting escalations, and making contingency plans. One afternoon, while I was out splitting firewood, she quietly told me she had spotted one of Karen's allies, a man named Tom, who was the HOA treasurer, circling the back of our property with a clipboard, pretending to check boundary markers. She didn't approach him, but instead took photos from the porch with her phone, documenting the time and date. "They're building a case," she said, "but it's going to backfire if they try anything formal." That same evening, a certified letter arrived, addressed from the HOA legal committee. The letter alleged that we had modified the exterior of the cabin without prior approval and that our unauthorized landscaping violated aesthetic guidelines. This was absurd. The only change we had made was planting a small herb garden near the porch, hardly a violation worth legal threats. My wife laughed when she read it, but I could see her jaw tighten. "They're not going to stop," she muttered, "but they're underestimating just how many resources I can call on if they push me." The following morning, we decided not to hide away, but to go about our lives normally. My wife went for her usual run along the wooded trails, while I worked on repairing the dock at the back of our property. Around midday, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked up to see two unmarked SUVs pulling up to the cabin. 4 men stepped out, 2 in suits, 2 in plain clothes, but the way they moved told me they weren't ordinary HOA volunteers. They carried themselves like law enforcement. My stomach tightened, but my wife emerged from the tree line at that exact moment, wearing her workout gear and still catching her breath. One of the men in suits stepped forward and introduced himself as Special Agent Miller with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. My wife didn't flinch. She recognized the name and knew immediately this wasn't a hostile visit. It turned out that Karen, in her desperation, had filed an anonymous security risk complaint against my wife with a federal tip line, claiming she was impersonating military personnel and using forged identification to intimidate the HOA. That complaint had triggered a mandatory verification process, which was why these agents had arrived. My wife calmly invited them inside, offered coffee, and provided her full credentials, including a direct line to her commanding officer, who confirmed her identity and active duty status within minutes. The agents, clearly embarrassed by the ridiculousness of the situation, apologized and explained that they were required to follow up on any tip, no matter how absurd it sounded. Before they left, one of them quietly said, "You might want to keep an eye on whoever sent this in. Making false reports to a federal agency isn't something we take lightly." My wife smiled politely, but I could see the gears turning in her mind. After the SUVs pulled away, she turned to me and said, "That's it. They've crossed into criminal territory. It's time to document everything and hand it over to the right people." Over the next few days, we began compiling every letter, notice, photo, and video clip related to Karen's harassment. My wife even pulled satellite images and time-stamped footage from a small drone she had deployed over the property as skill she had picked up during her military work. The evidence was damning. Karen and her allies trespassing, vandalizing, and attempting to interfere with our mail. She also had a detailed record of the federal complaint, which would now be part of an official case file. When we felt the dossier was complete, my wife contacted a friend in the Judge Advocate General's Corps JAG, who specialized in military personnel rights and civilian disputes. The friend agreed to review everything and confirmed what we suspected. The HOA's actions, especially Karen's false federal report, could lead to serious criminal charges. That knowledge seemed to lift a weight off my wife's shoulders. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was moving into offense. Meanwhile, Karen must have sensed that something was shifting because she started showing up at community spaces less often, sending her allies to do her bidding instead. She no longer confronted us directly, but the hostility was still there, simmering. The night before our next HOA meeting, my wife quietly rehearsed what she planned to say if confronted. She wasn't going to lose her temper. She was going to lay out the facts in front of witnesses and give Karen one last chance to back down before everything went to the authorities. That meeting would become a turning point, one where Karen's power began to crumble in ways she never saw coming. The air felt different the moment the cops turned to Karen with a mix of confusion and quiet reprimand. And while her jaw was still clenched in defiance, it was clear that something inside her was unraveling. My wife, still calm and composed, stood a few feet away, her military ID in her hand like a silent weapon that had just turned the entire situation upside down. The officers, now aware they had been called into a baseless confrontation, began questioning Karen instead, their tone sharper than before. She tried to talk her way out of it, painting herself as a concerned citizen, but every excuse she gave sounded weaker and more desperate, especially in the shadow of the truth about my wife's service. The neighbors who had gathered to see the drama unfold were now whispering among themselves, their eyes darting between Karen and us, realizing that the woman they once saw as an authority in the HOA had just been publicly humiliated. My wife didn't gloat, didn't even crack a smile. She simply stood tall, radiating the quiet strength that comes from years of discipline and service, and I could see Karen shrinking under the weight of it. The officers eventually left after, warning Karen about the consequences of false reports, and while she pretended to brush it off, the red flush in her face told a different story. Over the next few days, the neighborhood's tone toward us shifted. The same people who had once kept their distance now stopped to greet us, some even apologizing for not stepping in sooner when they'd seen Karen's harassment escalate. Karen herself became noticeably quieter, but I knew her silence wasn't surrender, it was planning. The way she lingered just a bit too long when passing our cabin, the way her blinds would tilt whenever my wife was outside. I installed cameras, reinforced locks, and made sure every inch of our property was secure. But what Karen didn't know was that my wife's connections and training meant we were more prepared than she could ever imagine. One evening, a thick envelope arrived in the mail with no return address. Inside was a stack of documents, HOA financial reports, minutes from closed-door meetings, and even emails implicating Karen in shady dealings involving property funds. Someone from within had decided to tip us off, and I couldn't help but suspect that Karen's arrogance had finally turned one of her own against her. My wife reviewed every page carefully, her eyes narrowing with each discovery, till she finally set the stack down and said, "We can end her reign with this." But we didn't rush. Wasn't enough to just expose her. We wanted it airtight, undeniable, and devastating. Weeks passed as my wife compiled evidence, cross-checking every transaction and connecting every dot, until we had a dossier that could bury Karen's influence once and for all. When the day came to present it to the HOA board, the meeting room was packed, the air thick with tension. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual smugness faltering as she noticed the thick binder my wife placed in front of the board members. Page by page, the evidence came out: misappropriated funds, violations of HOA rules she herself had enforced on others, even documented harassment cases. The murmurs in the room turned into sharp whispers, then outright accusations directed at Karen, who was now visibly sweating. By the end of it, the board voted unanimously to remove her from her position, citing both misconduct and abuse of power. Karen's face was a mask of rage and disbelief as she gathered her things. But the damage was done. Her authority was gone, and the hold she had over the neighborhood had crumbled in real time. The weeks that followed were the most peaceful we'd had since moving into the cabin. My wife and I would sit on the porch in the evenings, coffee in hand, watching the lake shimmer in the setting sun, no longer under the shadow of Karen's constant meddling. But as much as I enjoyed the quiet, I knew people like her rarely disappear completely. They retreat, they regroup, and sometimes they come back with sharper claws. That's why the day I spotted an unfamiliar car idling near the edge of the neighborhood, windows tinted just a bit too dark, I felt that familiar tension coil in my chest. My wife noticed it too, her gaze hardening as she said, "Looks like she's not done yet." We both knew this wasn't over, and as much as I wanted to believe we'd finally closed this chapter, I could feel another one brewing on the horizon. For those of you who've followed our journey through this mess, stick around, because if Karen thinks she can make a comeback, she's about to find out exactly what happens when you push the wrong people too far. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel so you don't miss what comes next, because trust me, it's going to get intense.